On a Saturday morning in 1988, a 9-year-old girl walked 50 feet from a grocery store entrance to retrieve her scooter, and in the span of 30 seconds, she vanished from the face of the earth. Before we dive into this haunting story, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. And if this case stays with you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow we uncover another story that will linger long after the screen fades to black. For 32 years, her mother kept a light burning in the window. She wrote letters to her daughter on every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary Tuesday when the grief became too heavy to carry alone. She became one of the most recognizable faces in the missing children's movement, testifying before Congress, appearing on national television, fighting for laws that would protect other families from the nightmare she was living. And for 32 years, the man who took Michaela Joy Garecht walked free. He lived his life, committed other crimes, sat in a prison cell for an unrelated murder, and never spoke a word about the little girl he had stolen from a parking lot in Hayward, California. Then, in 2020, a DNA match changed everything. The science that did not exist when Michaela disappeared had finally caught up with her case. The man who had eluded justice for 3 decades was identified, charged, and confronted with the evidence of what he had done. This is the story of Michaela Garecht, the mother who never stopped searching, and the long road to answers that took more than half a lifetime to travel. To understand what happened on November 19, 1988, we must first understand the world Michaela inhabited and the era in which she lived. The late 1980s were a time of transition in America, a period when the optimism of the Reagan years was giving way to something more uncertain. The crack cocaine epidemic was devastating inner cities. The AIDS crisis was reshaping public health. And yet, in suburban communities across the country, there remained a sense of safety, a belief that bad things happened somewhere else, to other people. Michaela Joy Garecht was born on January 24, 1979, in the San Francisco Bay Area, at a hospital in Oakland. Her mother, Sharon Murch, was young and hopeful, embarking on motherhood with all the dreams that new parents carry. Her father, Rod Garecht, was equally devoted, though the marriage between Sharon and Rod would not survive the pressures of young parenthood. By the time Michaela was old enough to remember, her parents had separated. But both remained committed to their daughter, sharing custody and working together to provide her with as much stability as a divided household could offer. Michaela spent weekdays with her mother in Hayward and many weekends with her father. She adapted to this arrangement with the resilience that children often display, finding ways to feel at home in 2 different places. Michaela was, by all accounts, a remarkable child, the kind of girl who drew people to her with her warmth and curiosity. She had long brown hair that she often wore in a ponytail, bright hazel eyes that seemed to take in everything around her, and a smile that could light up a room. She was small for her age, barely 4 feet tall, and weighing less than 70 pounds, with a delicate frame that made her seem younger than her 9 years. She loved animals, with a passion that bordered on obsession. Horses were her particular fascination, and she dreamed of one day having a horse of her own. She filled notebooks with drawings of horses, collected horse figurines, and talked about horses with anyone who would listen. Her mother would later say that she had planned to get Michaela riding lessons for her 10th birthday, a gift that would never be given. Beyond her love of animals, Michaela was creative in ways that suggested a rich inner life. She wrote stories, invented elaborate games with her friends, and had an imagination that could transform an ordinary afternoon into an adventure. She was also deeply empathetic, the kind of child who noticed when others were struggling and tried to help. If a classmate was sad, Michaela would sit with them. If someone was left out of a game, she would include them. Her teachers at Harder Elementary School remembered her as a good student, attentive, and curious, the kind of child who asked questions and genuinely wanted to understand the answers. She had a particular talent for reading, devouring books at a pace that impressed the adults around her. She was in 4th grade in the fall of 1988, navigating the social complexities of elementary school with relative ease. Hayward, the city where Michaela lived with her mother, was a working-class community of approximately 100,000 people, located in Alameda County on the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay. It was the kind of place where families had lived for generations, where people knew their neighbors and looked out for each other's children. The downtown area had small shops and restaurants, a public library that Michaela visited regularly, and the kind of tree-lined streets that suggested safety and permanence. In 1988, Hayward had not yet experienced the kind of crime that would later affect many Bay Area communities. There were problems, of course, as there are everywhere, but violent crime was relatively rare, and crimes against children were almost unheard of. Parents let their children walk to school, ride their bikes to friends' houses, play in the park without constant supervision. It was not naivety so much as experience. Nothing bad had happened here. Nothing bad would happen here. This sense of safety was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed children like Michaela to experience the kind of freedom that builds independence and confidence. But it also created a vulnerability, a blind spot that predators could exploit. The man who would take Michaela counted on that vulnerability. He knew that no one would be watching closely, that a child retrieving a scooter in a parking lot would not seem unusual, that he could act quickly before anyone understood what was happening. Sharon Murch was a single mother, doing her best to raise her daughter while working to support them both. She and Michaela had a close relationship, the kind of bond that forms when two people rely on each other. Sharon would later describe Michaela as her best friend, her confidant, the person who made every day worth living. In the fall of 1988, Michaela was in 4th grade at Harder Elementary School. She had a best friend named Katrina Rodriguez, a girl her own age who lived nearby. The two were inseparable, spending their weekends together, riding their scooters around the neighborhood, doing the things that 9-year-old girls did in that era, before smartphones and social media, when childhood still meant playing outside and using your imagination. November 19, 1988 was a Saturday that began like any other. The weather in Hayward was cool, but pleasant, with temperatures in the mid-50s and a sky that promised neither rain nor particular sunshine. It was the kind of day that invited outdoor activity, perfect for the kind of low-key adventure that 9-year-old girls found appealing. Michaela had spent the night at her friend Katrina's house, a sleepover that had been planned for days and anticipated with the excitement that such events generated at that age. The Rodriguez family lived in a modest home, not far from the Rainbow Market, in a neighborhood of similar houses where children played in the streets and parents chatted over fences. The girls had stayed up late the night before, talking about the things that 9-year-olds talk about, doing each other's hair and nails, making elaborate plans for the weekend ahead. They had watched movies, eaten popcorn, and generally enjoyed the particular pleasure of being best friends, spending time, together without the intrusion of adults or siblings. That morning, they woke up with the energy that comes from insufficient sleep and youthful enthusiasm. After breakfast, they decided to ride their scooters to the Rainbow Market, a small grocery store located in a strip mall on Mission Boulevard, about a block and a half from Katrina's house. Their mission was simple. They wanted to buy candy, specifically the kind of candy that their parents wouldn't buy for them, the sugar-laden treats that represented the height of 9-year-old indulgence. They told Katrina's mother, Anita Rodriguez, where they were going, and she gave them permission without hesitation. It was broad daylight, a Saturday morning when the streets were populated with other families going about their business. The store was close by, well within the boundary of where the girls were allowed to travel on their own. Mrs. Rodriguez would later be consumed by guilt over this decision, though she had done nothing that any other parent in the neighborhood would not have done. The girls set off on their scooters, probably chatting and laughing as they traveled the familiar route. They would have passed houses they knew, perhaps waved to neighbors, navigated the streets with the casual confidence of children who knew their territory. The ride took only a few minutes. The Rainbow Market was a small store, the kind of neighborhood grocery that has largely disappeared in the age of supermarket chains and big box retailers. It occupied a space in a modest strip mall, sharing the building with a few other small businesses. The parking lot in front of the store was not large, perhaps 24 spaces arranged in neat rows facing the storefronts. The girls arrived at the Rainbow Market sometime around 10 in the morning. They parked their scooters in front of the store, near the entrance where other shoppers would pass by. This was normal practice for children on scooters or bikes. You left your vehicle where you could see it from inside the store, where it would be waiting for you when you came back out. They browsed the candy aisle with the seriousness that children bring to such decisions, debating the merits of different options, calculating how to get the most sugar for their limited money. They made their selections, paid for their purchases at the counter, and headed back outside. The whole trip inside the store took perhaps 10 minutes, maybe less. When they pushed through the door and emerged into the parking lot, something was wrong. Michaela's scooter had been moved. It was no longer leaning against the wall where she had left it. Instead, it was lying on the ground in the parking lot, several spaces away from the store entrance, near a parked car that neither girl recognized. This detail is crucial to understanding what happened next. The scooter had been deliberately moved to lure Michaela away from the safety of the store entrance, away from the eyes of other shoppers and employees, into a more isolated position in the parking lot. Whoever moved it had planned this carefully, had watched the girls arrive, had seen where they parked their scooters, had waited for them to go inside. He had then moved Michaela's scooter to a location near his own vehicle, creating a trap that would bring his target directly to him. The planning involved in this action speaks to a predator who had done this before, or at least had thought about it extensively. He knew that a 9-year-old girl would walk toward her own scooter without suspicion. He knew that her friend would likely wait by the store while Michaela retrieved it. He knew that he had perhaps 30 seconds to act, and he had positioned himself to make the most of those seconds. Michaela walked toward her scooter, probably annoyed that someone had knocked it over, perhaps slightly puzzled about how it had ended up so far from where she had left it. She may have suspected neighborhood kids playing a prank, or she may not have thought about it at all. She was focused on retrieving her scooter, so she and Katrina could continue their day. Katrina stayed near the store entrance, waiting for her friend. This was natural. Michaela was just going to grab her scooter. There was no reason for both of them to walk across the parking lot. Katrina may have been looking at her own scooter, checking her candy, or simply watching Michaela walk away. What happened in the next 30 seconds would haunt Katrina Rodriguez for the rest of her life. As Michaela bent down to pick up her scooter, a man emerged from behind or beside the parked car. He was white, in his mid-20s, with an unkempt appearance that suggested someone who did not take care of himself. His hair was disheveled. His clothes were unremarkable, the kind of nondescript outfit that would not draw attention. He moved quickly, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment. He grabbed Michaela before she could react. According to Katrina's account, given to police in the hours and days that followed, Michaela screamed once, a sound of pure terror that cut through the ordinary noises of a Saturday morning. It was a scream that would echo in Katrina's memory for decades, a sound she would never forget, no matter how much she might want to. The man threw Michaela into his car, an older model sedan that witnesses would later describe as brown or tan in color, possibly a 1970s Dodge or Plymouth. The car was unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that would not stand out in any parking lot. The man got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away. The whole sequence, from the moment he grabbed Michaela to the moment the car disappeared from view, took perhaps 20 to 30 seconds. Katrina stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. One moment, her friend had been there, bending down to retrieve her scooter. The next moment, she was gone, taken by a stranger, thrown into a car that was now accelerating out of the parking lot. The human brain is not designed to process such sudden, violent changes in reality. Katrina's shock was total and overwhelming. By the time her paralysis began to fade, by the time she thought to scream for help or to run after the car, it was already too late. The vehicle was disappearing down Mission Boulevard, carrying Michaela away from everything she had known, toward a fate that no one could yet imagine. Katrina ran back to the store, crying and nearly incoherent, trying to explain what had happened. The store employees, confronted with a hysterical child talking about her friend being grabbed and thrown into a car, initially struggled to understand. But they quickly grasped the horror of what Katrina was describing and sprang into action. Someone called 911. The call was logged at 10:15 a.m., less than 15 minutes after the girls had entered the store. The dispatcher who took the call heard the urgency in the caller's voice and immediately classified it as a priority. A child abduction in progress. Suspect fleeing in a tan or brown sedan. Last seen heading west on Mission Boulevard. Someone else called Katrina's mother. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived at the store within minutes, her own panic barely contained, as she tried to comfort her traumatized daughter, while simultaneously grasping the magnitude of what had occurred. Michaela was gone. Someone had taken her, and no one knew where. And then someone had to make the call that every parent dreads receiving. The call that would shatter Sharon Murch's world into pieces that could never be fully reassembled. Sharon was at home that Saturday morning, going about the ordinary business of a weekend day. Perhaps she was cleaning, or reading, or simply enjoying the quiet of a house temporarily empty of her energetic daughter. She had no premonition of what was coming, no sense that her life was about to divide into before and after. When the phone rang, she answered it without suspicion, and then she heard the words, delivered by a voice she barely recognized through its own panic and grief. Michaela had been taken. Someone had grabbed her in a parking lot and driven away with her. Her daughter was gone. Sharon would later describe this moment with the kind of clarity that trauma can sear into memory. Every detail was burned into her consciousness. The way the light came through the window, the sound of her own voice asking questions she did not want answered, the feeling of the floor seeming to shift beneath her feet. She heard the words, but they did not compute. Her brain kept rejecting them, trying to find an alternative interpretation that did not mean what it obviously meant. The next hours passed in a blur of police officers, questions, and the growing realization that this was not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, not something that would be quickly resolved. The Hayward Police Department responded immediately, dispatching officers to the Rainbow Market, canvassing the neighborhood, putting out alerts to law enforcement agencies throughout the region. But Michaela was already gone, vanished into a void that would remain empty for more than 3 decades. The investigation that followed was massive by the standards of 1988. One of the largest mobilizations of law enforcement resources the Bay Area had seen in years. Within hours of the abduction, more than 100 officers from the Hayward Police Department, neighboring jurisdictions, and state agencies were involved in the search. Detective Steve Gillick was assigned as the lead investigator on the case. He was a veteran officer with years of experience, but nothing in his background had prepared him for the particular horror of a child abduction. The first 48 hours, he knew, were critical. Statistics showed that if a kidnapped child was not recovered within that window, the chances of a good outcome dropped dramatically. Roadblocks were established on major arteries leading out of Hayward. Every tan or brown sedan matching the general description was stopped and inspected. Helicopters swept overhead, looking for any sign of the vehicle or its occupant. Officers went door to door in the neighborhoods surrounding the Rainbow Market, asking if anyone had seen anything, any detail that might help. The response from the community was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of tips poured in from people who thought they had seen something, who remembered a suspicious car, who wanted desperately to help find the missing girl. Each lead was documented and followed up. Most led nowhere. Some seemed promising for a moment before collapsing into dead ends. A witness came forward who thought she had seen the car heading east on Tennyson Road. Another thought he had seen it heading west on Mission Boulevard. A third claimed to have seen a similar vehicle parked near a park earlier that morning. Investigators worked to reconcile these conflicting accounts, to build a timeline of where the kidnapper might have gone after leaving the parking lot. Flyers with Michaela's photograph were distributed throughout the Bay Area and beyond. Her face, with its bright smile and trusting eyes, appeared on telephone poles, in store windows, on the bulletin boards of community centers and churches. Within days, her image was one of the most recognized in the region. The composite sketch was created based on Katrina's description of the man who had taken her friend. Working with a police artist, Katrina described what she had seen: a white male, mid-20s, with a round face, disheveled brown hair, and a somewhat vacant expression. The sketch that emerged was both specific and maddeningly generic. The face of a man who could have been anyone, who could have blended into any crowd. The sketch was released to the public with an appeal for information. Tips came in from people who thought they recognized the man. A store clerk in Fremont said he looked like a customer who had come in recently. A woman in Oakland was certain he was her neighbor. A man in San Jose thought he had seen him at a gas station. Each identification was investigated, and each turned out to be wrong. The FBI became involved within days of the abduction, bringing federal resources and expertise to the investigation. Special Agent Mary Ellen O'Toole, a profiler with the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit, developed a psychological portrait of the likely perpetrator. She described him as probably a loner, someone with difficulty forming normal relationships, possibly with a history of sexual offenses or peeping incidents. He had likely fantasized about this type of crime for a long time before acting on it. The profile helped narrow the focus somewhat, but it did not point to a specific individual. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of men in the Bay Area who might fit the general description. Without more specific evidence, investigators were left with an overwhelming number of possibilities and no clear path forward. As the days turned to weeks and the weeks to months, the intensive first phase of the investigation began to wind down. Not because anyone had given up, but because there were no new leads to follow, no fresh evidence to analyze. The case remained open and technically active, with detectives assigned to follow up on any new information that came in. But the reality was that it had stalled. For Sharon Murch, the fading of the initial investigation was devastating. The intense activity of those first weeks had been terrifying, but it had also felt purposeful. Something was being done. People were looking. As that activity diminished, Sharon found herself facing a different kind of horror, the prospect of a future defined by not knowing. She could not accept it. She would not accept it. In the weeks and months after Michaela's disappearance, Sharon made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not sit and wait for news. She would not passively hope that someone else would find her daughter. She would become, in her own words, a mother on a mission. Her first efforts were local. She organized search parties, coordinating volunteers to comb through areas where Michaela might be found. She distributed flyers herself, standing on street corners and in shopping centers, showing Michaela's picture to anyone who would look. She called the police department daily, sometimes multiple times a day, asking about new leads, new developments, anything that might bring her daughter home. She also began reaching out to other families of missing children. In 1988, there was no internet to connect these families, no social media to share information and support. But there were organizations, fledgling groups dedicated to helping families of the missing, and Sharon found her way to them. Through these connections, she discovered a community of parents united by the worst thing that could happen to a parent. These were people who understood her pain in a way that others could not, who did not expect her to move on or find closure, who knew that some wounds do not heal, but must simply be carried. These connections would sustain Sharon through the decades ahead. She became involved with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which had been founded just 4 years before Michaela's disappearance. She worked with the Jacob Wetterling Foundation, named for another child who had been abducted in 1989. She connected with the parents of other missing children, some famous, most not, all of them bound together by a grief that only they could truly understand. As her involvement in the missing children's movement deepened, Sharon began to transform her grief into advocacy. She spoke at conferences and community events, sharing Michaela's story and using it to raise awareness about child safety. She testified before legislative bodies, pushing for stronger laws to protect children and to improve the response to abductions. In 1990, she appeared before a California state legislative committee considering new requirements for sex offender registration. Her testimony was powerful, the words of a mother whose child had been stolen and whose abductor remained unidentified. The committee members listened in silence as she described the moment she learned Michaela was gone, the endless nights of not knowing, the particular torture of living without answers. She also began speaking directly to Michaela's kidnapper, in interviews and later online, appealing to whatever conscience he might possess. She asked him to let Michaela go, if she was still alive, to tell someone where she was. She told him that she did not care about punishment or justice, only about getting her daughter back. These appeals would go unanswered for more than 3 decades. In the mid-1990s, as the Internet began to emerge as a tool for communication and organization, Sharon saw its potential for keeping Michaela's case alive. She started a blog, one of the first by a family member of a missing person, where she could write about her daughter, share memories, and maintain a public presence for the case. The blog became a window into Sharon's soul, a place where she wrote with raw honesty about her grief, her hope, her frustration, and her determination. She wrote about the good days, when hope felt possible, and the bad days when despair threatened to overwhelm her. She wrote about the small details of Michaela's life, the things she was afraid of forgetting, the memories she was desperate to preserve. She also used the blog to connect with others who were touched by Michaela's story. Readers from around the world wrote to share their support, to tell Sharon that they were thinking of her, to ask how they could help. The blog created a community of people who had never met Michaela, but who felt invested in her case, who checked for updates, and hoped for news. Through all of this, Sharon maintained her focus on the investigation itself. She met regularly with the detectives assigned to Michaela's case, reviewing evidence, discussing leads, pushing for new approaches. She hired private investigators at various points when she felt the official investigation was not moving quickly enough. She followed up on tips herself when she felt they were not being adequately addressed. She also kept a light burning in her window, a small lamp that stayed on day and night, year after year. It was a beacon, a symbol of her belief that Michaela would one day find her way home. The light became well known in her neighborhood, a constant reminder of what had happened and what remained unresolved. But the years passed, and Michaela did not come home. Sharon celebrated birthdays without her daughter, marking each one with a mixture of hope and grief. On January 24, 1989, Michaela turned 10 wherever she was. Sharon bought a birthday cake and lit candles, maintaining rituals in the absence of the person they were meant to honor. On January 24, 1994, Michaela would have been 15, a teenager navigating high school, first crushes, the complicated journey toward adulthood. Sharon wondered what she would have looked like, what music she would have listened to, what her dreams would have become. On January 24, 1989, Michaela would have been 20, an adult by any measure, perhaps in college, perhaps starting a career, perhaps falling in love. The horse-loving little girl would have grown into a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Sharon marked the day as she marked every birthday, every Christmas, every Mother's Day, with a combination of remembrance and unbearable loss. She watched other children grow up, Michaela's classmates and friends, who had continued on the path that Michaela had been forced to leave. Katrina Rodriguez graduated from high school, went to college, started her own life. The children who had played with Michaela became teenagers, then adults, then parents themselves. Sharon watched them pass through milestones that her own daughter would never reach. She imagined what might have been, graduations she would have attended, wedding dresses she might have helped choose, grandchildren who might have called her grandma. These phantom lives played out in her imagination, beautiful and terrible, always out of reach. She did not know if Michaela was alive somewhere, living a life that Sharon could not see, or if she had died decades ago, her death as unknown as her disappearance. The case remained open, but it was cold. The Hayward Police Department had done everything they could with the tools available to them, but those tools were limited by the technology of the era. In 1988, DNA analysis was in its infancy, capable of ruling out suspects, but rarely able to identify them. Genetic genealogy, the technique that would eventually solve the case, did not exist even as a concept. The internet was just beginning to emerge as a force that might help connect scattered pieces of information. The evidence that had been collected in 1988 was preserved carefully, stored in climate-controlled facilities where it would not degrade. Investigators knew, even then, that technology would advance, that methods not yet invented might someday be able to extract information from that evidence. They were betting on a future they could not yet see. As the 1990s gave way to the 2000s and the 2000s to the 2010s, the investigation continued to receive occasional attention. The case was featured on television programs dedicated to missing persons and unsolved crimes. Each appearance on America's Most Wanted, or a similar show, generated a new wave of tips, and each wave led nowhere. In 2004, the case was featured on a segment of Unsolved Mysteries. The show reconstructed the abduction using actors, showed the composited sketch, and appealed for anyone with information to come forward. The response was significant. Hundreds of people called the tip line. Some claimed to have seen Michaela in various locations around the country. Some thought they recognized the man in the sketch. Some simply wanted to express their sympathy and support. None of the tips led to Michaela. In 2009, there was a moment of terrible hope. Investigators informed Sharon that remains matching the general description of Michaela had been found. The body was that of a young female who had been murdered years earlier, and the circumstances were consistent with what might have happened to Michaela. Sharon had to wait while DNA testing was conducted, had to sit with the possibility that her daughter's body had finally been found, that the worst had been confirmed. The waiting was a special kind of agony. The uncertainty that had defined her life for 2 decades, crystallizing into a specific, concrete fear. When the results came back, they ruled out the remains as Michaela's. The relief was strange and incomplete, mixed with grief for whoever that young woman had been, mixed with the return of the uncertainty that Sharon had learned to live with. Her daughter was still missing. The answer was still unknown. Throughout these years, investigators in Hayward and at the FBI continued to work the case quietly. They maintained the evidence, hoping that advancing technology would eventually provide answers. They reviewed old tips periodically, looking for details that might have been missed. They watched as DNA technology improved, as databases grew, as new techniques were developed. One case in particular drew their attention. In 1989, less than a year after Michaela's abduction, another young girl had been kidnapped from a Bay Area location under strikingly similar circumstances. Eileen Michaloff, 13 years old, had vanished while walking home from school in Dublin, California, about 15 miles from where Michaela had been taken. The similarities were too close to ignore. Both victims were young girls, abducted in broad daylight from public locations. Both abductions occurred in the East Bay, within a relatively small geographic area. Both involved a predator who had apparently studied his victim's movements and waited for an opportunity to strike. Investigators suspected the same person might be responsible for both crimes. The connection between the cases was investigated but never definitively established during the years when both remained unsolved. Witnesses in the Michaela case described a vehicle similar to the one seen in Michaela's abduction, but the descriptions were not identical. The method of approach seemed similar, but there were differences in the details. Investigators kept both cases in mind, looking for the thread that might connect them, but the thread remained elusive. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived not through traditional detective work, but through the revolutionary technology of forensic genetic genealogy. This technique, which had begun to transform cold case investigations in the late 2010s, involved uploading DNA profiles to genealogy databases and using family connections to identify potential suspects. The method had been pioneered in the Golden State Killer case, where it led to the identification and arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo in 2018. After that success, law enforcement agencies across the country began applying the technique to their own cold cases. The results were remarkable. Cases that had been unsolved for decades were suddenly yielding identifications. In the case of Michaela Garecht, investigators had preserved evidence from the scene, including items that the kidnapper had touched when he moved Michaela's scooter. This evidence had been analyzed using the DNA technology available in 1988, but that technology had been too primitive to yield useful results. As DNA analysis improved over the years, the evidence was reanalyzed multiple times, with each new generation of technology extracting a bit more information than the last. But it still did not produce a match in traditional law enforcement databases like CODIS. Then came genetic genealogy. The DNA profile extracted from the evidence was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where millions of people had submitted their own DNA to trace their family histories. Unlike law enforcement databases, which contain only the DNA of convicted criminals and crime scene evidence, genealogy databases contain the DNA of ordinary people, people with no criminal history who simply wanted to learn about their ancestry. The search was painstaking, requiring specialist genealogists to build family trees from distant matches and work backward through generations to identify potential suspects. The process could take months, even years, as researchers traced family lines through public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries. It was detective work of a new kind, combining genetic science with old-fashioned genealogical research. In 2020, the search yielded a name, David Emery Mish. David Emery Mish was not unknown to law enforcement. Far from it. He had a criminal history that stretched back decades, a record of violence that should have made him a suspect in cases like Michaela's long before genetic genealogy existed. Mish was born in 1959 in the San Francisco Bay Area. From an early age, he displayed the warning signs that often precede a life of violence. He had difficulty in school, struggled to form normal relationships, and showed a fascination with control and domination that unsettled those around him. By his late teens, he had begun accumulating a criminal record, starting with minor offenses and escalating to more serious crimes. In January 1986, nearly 3 years before Michaela's abduction, Mish had committed a murder. His victim was Michelle Xavier, a 20-year-old woman whose body was found in Fremont, California, not far from where Michaela would later be taken. Michelle had been strangled, her body left in a remote area. The crime scene showed evidence of sexual assault. Mish was identified as a suspect in Michelle Xavier's murder relatively quickly. He had been seen in the area, had a history with the victim, and could not account for his whereabouts at the time of the killing. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. The sentence was life in prison. When Mish went to prison for Michelle Xavier's murder in 1987, investigators had no idea that he had already committed or would go on to commit additional crimes. The concept of a serial offender was understood, but the tools to link crimes across jurisdictions and across time were limited. Mish's prior history was known, but the extent of his predation was not. Now, with the genetic genealogy match in hand, investigators began to look at David Mish with new eyes. His criminal history showed a pattern of violence against women and girls. His location in November 1988 placed him in the East Bay, out on parole between his arrest for Michelle Xavier's murder and his return to prison when that conviction was finalized. His physical description matched, in general terms, the composite sketch that Katrina Rodriguez had helped create. The identification of Mish opened a new chapter in the investigation. Alameda County prosecutors, working with the Hayward Police Department, the FBI, and the California Department of Justice, began building a case against him for Michaela's kidnapping and murder. The evidence was compelling but not without challenges. More than 30 years had passed since the crime. The DNA match was strong, but defense attorneys could be expected to challenge the methodology of genetic genealogy, which was still relatively new and had not been tested in many court cases. Witnesses had died or become unavailable. Memories had faded. The case would have to be assembled carefully, with attention to every potential weakness. Investigators also explored possible connections to other unsolved cases. The 1989 disappearance of Eileen Michaloff remained open, and the similarities to Michaela's case were striking. If Mish had abducted Michaela while on parole in 1988, might he have committed similar crimes at other times when he was free? The investigation expanded to consider these possibilities. In December 2020, David Emery Mish was charged with the kidnapping and murder of Michaela Garecht. The charging documents laid out the evidence, the DNA match, the circumstantial evidence placing him in the area, his history of violence against women. He was 61 years old, already serving a life sentence, but now facing additional charges that would ensure no possibility of release. For Sharon Murch, the news brought a complex mixture of emotions that she struggled to articulate. After 32 years of not knowing, she finally had a name, a face to attach to the man who had destroyed her family. She could look at photographs of David Mish and know that this was the person who had taken her daughter, who had ended her life, who had condemned Sharon to 3 decades of uncertainty and grief. But the identification also brought the confirmation she had dreaded for so long. David Mish was a convicted murderer. He had killed before Michaela's abduction and had likely killed after. The hope that Michaela might somehow still be alive, a hope that Sharon had clung to despite all evidence and reason, was finally and definitively extinguished. Sharon wrote about her reaction on her blog, sharing her thoughts with the community that had supported her for so many years. She described the strange experience of finally having an answer, of knowing both too much and too little. She knew who had taken Michaela. She did not know exactly what had happened to her daughter, where her remains might be, what her final moments had been like. She also expressed something that surprised many who followed her story. She said she felt a kind of gratitude, not for what had happened, but for the resolution that had finally come. For 32 years, she had lived in a particular kind of purgatory, unable to fully grieve because she did not know for certain that Michaela was dead, unable to fully hope because the circumstances of the abduction made survival seem unlikely. Now, at least, she knew. In the months that followed, investigators continued to build their case against Mish. They also continued to explore possible connections to other unsolved cases, including the Eileen Misheloff disappearance. While Mish was not charged in that case during this period, investigators indicated that the investigation was ongoing. David Mish, for his part, said nothing. He did not confess to Michaela's murder. He did not provide information about what had happened to her, where her remains might be found, or whether he had been responsible for other crimes. He maintained his silence, as he had maintained it for more than 3 decades, protected by the constitutional right against self-incrimination and apparently indifferent to the suffering his silence caused. Sharon and other advocates pushed for legislation that would require convicted criminals to provide information about their victims in exchange for certain privileges. The idea was controversial, raising questions about coerced confessions and constitutional rights, but it reflected the frustration of families who had answers about who had hurt their loved ones, but no answers about what had happened to them. In 2021, before his case for Michaela's murder could proceed to trial, David Emery Mish died in prison. He was 62 years old. The official cause of death was reported as natural causes, though the specific circumstances were not immediately disclosed. The death of David Mish closed one chapter of the story, but left others painfully unfinished. For Sharon Murch, the identification of her daughter's killer had brought a measure of closure, but it had also brought new grief and new frustration. She knew now, with terrible certainty, that Michaela was dead. She knew who had killed her. But she did not know exactly what had happened, and she did not have her daughter's remains to bury. The question of where Michaela's body might be remains unanswered to this day. Investigators have searched locations associated with Mish, have analyzed his movements during the period when Michaela disappeared, have looked for any indication of where he might have taken her, but without a confession, without testimony from someone who knew what Mish had done, the location of Michaela's remains may never be discovered. Sharon has continued her advocacy work in the years since Mish's identification and death. She has spoken publicly about the case, about the importance of DNA technology in solving cold cases, about the need for continued investment in missing persons investigations. She has also spoken about the complex nature of closure, how finding answers does not erase grief, how knowing the truth can bring both relief and new pain. In interviews, she has described the experience of finally having an answer as bittersweet in the truest sense of that word. There is sweetness in resolution, in the end of not knowing, in the ability to grieve fully rather than living in the limbo of uncertainty. But there is also bitterness in what the resolution reveals, in the knowledge of what happened to her daughter, in the face of the man who caused so much suffering. She has also spoken about the things she still does not know, the questions that may never be answered. She does not know exactly what happened to Michaela after she was taken from that parking lot. She does not know if her daughter suffered, if she had time to understand what was happening, if she called out for her mother in her final moments. These unknowns haunt Sharon, even as she has learned to live with them. The case of Michaela Garecht has implications that extend beyond one family's tragedy. It demonstrates both the power and the limitations of modern forensic technology. DNA evidence and genetic genealogy can identify perpetrators decades after their crimes, can bring resolution to families who have waited years for answers, can ensure that killers do not escape justice simply because they were not caught at the time. But the technology cannot undo the harm that has been done. It cannot bring back the dead. It cannot answer every question. The case also highlights the importance of preserving evidence in cold cases. The DNA that eventually identified David Misch had been collected in 1988 using the best practices available at the time. It had been stored carefully for more than 30 years, waiting for technology to catch up with the crime. If that evidence had been lost or degraded, if it had been discarded during one of the periodic purges that some law enforcement agencies conduct, the case might never have been solved. This lesson has not been lost on law enforcement agencies around the country. In the wake of cases like Michaela's, many departments have implemented new protocols for evidence preservation, ensuring that biological material from unsolved cases is maintained indefinitely. The investment is significant, but the potential payoff, in terms of cases solved and families who receive answers, is immeasurable. Perhaps most importantly, the case illustrates the human cost of crimes against children and the enduring impact on families and communities. Michaela Garecht was 9 years old when she was taken. She had her whole life ahead of her, dreams of horses and friends, and all the experiences that make up a childhood and a life beyond. That future was stolen from her by a man who had no right to take it, who acted on impulses that society cannot fully explain and can never fully prevent. Her mother, Sharon, spent 32 years in a kind of suspended grief, unable to fully mourn because she did not know for certain what had happened, unable to fully hope because the circumstances of the abduction made survival seem unlikely. She transformed her pain into advocacy, helping other families and pushing for changes in the way missing children's cases are handled. But no amount of advocacy could bring her daughter back or fill the void that Michaela's absence created. Katrina Rodriguez, the friend who witnessed the abduction, has carried her own burden across the decades. She was 9 years old when she watched her best friend being taken, too young to intervene, too shocked to react in the moment. She has spoken publicly about the guilt she felt for years, the irrational but powerful sense that she should have done something to save Michaela, that if she had screamed louder or run faster, things might have been different. Survivors of trauma often carry such guilt, and Katrina's burden was heavier than most. She was the last person to see Michaela alive, the only witness to what happened. She had to tell the story over and over to police and FBI agents and journalists and television producers, reliving the worst moment of her childhood each time. The psychological toll of that experience shaped her life in ways that are difficult to fully measure. The community of Hayward, too, was changed by what happened on that November morning. A place where parents felt safe letting their children ride scooters to the corner store became, overnight, a place where such innocence seemed naive, even dangerous. Parents who had grown up with the freedom to roam became more protective of their own children, more aware of the dangers that had always existed, but had seemed remote. The Rainbow Market itself became a kind of landmark, a place that people drove past and remembered. The strip mall where it was located continued to operate, businesses coming and going over the years. But the memory of what had happened there persisted. Even people who moved to Hayward long after 1988 learned about Michaela Garecht, heard the story, understood that this was a place where something terrible had occurred. In the end, the story of Michaela Garecht is a story without a fully satisfying conclusion. Justice, in the traditional sense, was never completely achieved. David Misch died before he could be tried for her kidnapping and murder. He never confessed, never expressed remorse, never provided the information that might have allowed Sharon to bring her daughter's remains home for burial. The system worked, in the sense that the perpetrator was identified, but it did not work perfectly, and it did not work in time. But there is another kind of resolution, one that exists alongside the pain and the unanswered questions. Michaela's case was solved. Her killer was identified. The uncertainty that had tormented her family for 32 years was finally resolved, and the techniques that solved her case have gone on to solve other cases, bringing answers to other families who waited in the same terrible limbo. Sharon Murch has spoken about the bittersweet nature of this resolution. She knows now what happened to her daughter, even if she does not know every detail. She can mourn fully, something she could not do when hope still lingered. And she can take comfort in the knowledge that Michaela's case helped advance the science and the advocacy that will protect other children. The light that Sharon kept burning in her window for 32 years has a different meaning now. It no longer burns as a beacon to guide Michaela home. Instead, it burns as a memorial, a reminder of a girl who was loved, who was lost, and who was never forgotten. Michaela Joy Garecht would have been 46 years old this year. She would have lived through the transformations of the past 3 decades, the rise of the internet, the advent of smartphones, the changes in culture and society that have reshaped the world. She might have married, had children, pursued the dreams she spoke of as a 9-year-old girl. All of that was taken from her on a Saturday morning in November 1988 in a parking lot in Hayward, California. But her memory endures. Her mother's advocacy has helped protect countless children and families. Her case has advanced the cause of justice for other victims. And her name, spoken after 3 decades of silence, serves as a reminder that no case is ever truly cold, that technology continues to advance, that the truth has a way of emerging even when it seems impossibly buried. The story of Michaela Garecht is at its heart a story about love. The love of a mother who never stopped searching, who transformed her grief into purpose, who kept faith even when faith seemed foolish. The love of a community that refused to forget a missing child. The love of investigators who preserved evidence for decades, believing that someday it would matter. That love did not bring Michaela back. Nothing could have done that. But it ensured that she was not forgotten, that her case was not abandoned, that justice was pursued, even when it seemed impossible to achieve. There are other children still missing, other families still waiting for answers. The techniques that solved Michaela's case are being applied to cold cases across the country, bringing hope to families who have waited years or decades for resolution. Each case solved is a testament to the persistence of love, the power of science, and the refusal to accept that some crimes are simply unsolvable. Sharon Murch continues her advocacy work, even now. She speaks at conferences, consults with law enforcement agencies, and supports other families of missing children. She does this work in Michaela's name, carrying her daughter's memory forward into a future that Michaela never got to see. In one of her blog posts, written years before her daughter's case was solved, Sharon expressed a thought that resonates even more powerfully now. She wrote that she hoped Michaela knew, wherever she was, how much she was loved. She hoped that in whatever moments remained to her, Michaela had felt that love surrounding her, protecting her, holding her close. We cannot know if Michaela felt that love. We cannot know what happened in her final moments. But we can know that the love Sharon spoke of was real, that it endured for 32 years without faltering, and that it ultimately played a part in bringing her daughter's case to resolution. That is the legacy of Michaela Joy Garecht. Not just a victim, not just a case file, but a beloved daughter whose mother's love never wavered, and whose memory continues to make a difference in the world. Thanks for being here and listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care with your loved ones.